They say some jobs just stick with you not because of the work itself, but because of what they leave behind in your heart. I walked into that house thinking I was just going to slap a fresh coat of paint on some old kitchen walls and collect a paycheck. I didn't know I was about to meet a woman who'd make me question what connection really means. What age really changes, and what kind of feelings can sneak up on you when you least expect it. By the time I rolled on that last layer of mint green, I wasn't thinking about finishing the job. I was thinking about her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It was a Wednesday morning when I pulled up to the small pale yellow house on a quiet cul-de-sac in Clearwater Springs. The town itself always felt like it was resting nothing, ever moved too fast, and no one seemed in a rush. The job came through a referral from a buddy of mine who handled flooring, said the woman needed someone trustworthy. I was between projects, and figured why not? When I knocked on the door, I expected someone older, maybe retired. Instead, she opened it with one hand on her hip and a phone tucked under her ear. Mid-laugh at whatever conversation she was wrapping up, auburn hair tied in a high messy bun, dark-rimmed glasses, and a pair of paint-stained yoga pants. She looked like someone who tried to start the job herself and gave up halfway. She gave me a quick once-over, then motioned for me to come inside. "Kitchen's that way," she said, her voice steady but slightly amused, like she already had a sense. I might not be what she expected either. The place had charm. It wasn't big, but you could tell she had an eye for detail. Plants and mismatched pots lined the windowsill. Light yellow curtains swayed in the breeze, and a candle burned on the countertop that smelled faintly like cinnamon and cedar. The kitchen walls, however, were another story. Half the paint had been stripped, and there were sample swatches in no less than 5 colors. "I got carried away," she said when she caught me scanning the mess. "Thought I could handle it myself. Turns out painting over dark plum is a nightmare." I set down my tools and glanced at the samples. She'd settled on a soft mint green, safe, clean, and calm. Maybe that said something about her. "My name's Eliza, by the way," she added, offering her hand. Her grip was firm, warm. I told her my name Benand. We got started. The first hour passed mostly in silence. She drifted in and out of the room, sometimes checking her phone, sometimes watching me work. I didn't mind. Most homeowners either hovered too much or stayed away entirely. She hovered just enough. At one point, she put on some music, an old Nora Jones album, and the low hum of her voice joined in on a few tracks as she sang under her breath. I'd been doing this kind of work for a few years now. I'd seen homes in chaos, couples fighting, kids screaming, dogs barking, but this one felt still. Not lonely exactly, just still, like everything was paused and waiting around noon. She poked her head into the kitchen and asked if I wanted coffee. Accepted, and she returned a few minutes later with 2 mugs. She leaned against the counter and watched me paint, sipping her cup in silence. So she finally said, "What's the weirdest job you've ever done?" I smiled, grateful for the opening, and told her about a time I painted a nursery that turned into a petting zoo halfway through the week. She laughed, like really laughed, and the way her eyes squinted slightly when she did made me pause a second longer before dipping my roller back in the tray. She told me she used to be an art teacher before switching to remote work in publishing. Spent years telling kids to color inside the lines. Now, I edit books for people who don't believe in grammar. She joked. There was something about the way she carried herself, witty, observant, but not trying too hard. She'd been through something. You could tell by the occasional flicker in her expression, like a window that shuts for a moment and reopens as if nothing happened. As I wrapped up for the day, she asked how many more sessions it would take. I told her probably 2 more too. Finish the coats and do the touch-ups. She nodded and said, "All right, I'll make sure there's coffee again. Maybe something stronger by Friday." I packed up my gear and gave her a small nod before heading out. As I got into my truck, I sat for a moment longer than usual, just looking at the house through the windshield. I didn't know what it was exactly, but something about that kitchen, something about her, felt different. That night, I couldn't shake the sound of her laugh, the way her fingers curled around the coffee mug, or how she looked at me when she asked about the weirdest job I'd done. I'd been on hundreds of jobs. Why did this one already feel like it was going to linger? Maybe it was the way the light hit the walls when she leaned in to inspect the colors. Or maybe it was just the quiet way she existed, without apology, in her own space. I didn't know, but I found myself checking the clock more than usual the next day, already anticipating being back there, and something told me this job wasn't going to be simple as just painting a kitchen. Thursday morning rolled in with a light drizzle, the kind that coated everything in a soft gray mist without quite committing to a real rain. I loaded up my truck a little earlier than usual, tossing in my rollers, drop cloths, and the rest of my gear. I told myself it was just to beat traffic, but I knew that wasn't it. There was something about that house, that kitchen, that woman. It wasn't loud or flashy, but it pulled at me in a way I didn't know how to explain. When I arrived, Eliza was already awake and dressed, hair still damp from the shower, wearing an oversized sweater and faded jeans. She opened the door with one hand holding her coffee and gave me that half smile, the kind people give when they're glad to see you, but don't want to make a big deal out of it. I stepped inside, already familiar with the way the place smelled somewhere between old books and vanilla. The kitchen looked exactly as I'd left it, except now there was a small vase of fresh flowers sitting on the counter, a pop of yellow against all that mint green and white. She had moved a few things out of the way, clearing more space for me. To work, it was subtle, but it meant something. Most clients didn't think ahead like that. She offered me coffee again, and I took it, grateful not just for the drink, but for the gesture. As I set up, we talked more this time, not deep things, just easy, casual topics. Music, books, favorite meals, odd habits. She told me she used to have this ritual of making lasagna every Sunday, even when it was just for herself, because it reminded her of her grandmother. I told her I once painted a mural on the side of a local animal shelter for free just because. The manager looked like he needed someone to do something kind. We weren't trying to impress each other. It felt like we were just slowly opening windows, letting each other peek inside. She hovered a bit more that day, but in a way that felt natural. At one point, she asked if I minded if she worked in the breakfast nook while I painted. I told her it was her house. Of course not. She set up her laptop at the small round table near the window, typing away as I rolled the mint green across the top half of the far wall. Occasionally, she'd glance up and ask me about my process, or joke about how glad she was that she didn't attempt it herself. I noticed things that day I hadn't before. The way she furrowed her brow when she was concentrating. How she hummed under her breath when reading something. The way she gently tapped the keys, not in frustration, but with care. Like each sentence mattered. Around noon, she made sandwiches and insisted I sit down to eat. I usually ate in my truck just to keep that separation between me and the client. But something about her made it feel different, more like I was being invited into something, not just accommodated. We sat at the breakfast nook, the same spot she'd been working. The rain had stopped by then, and the mist outside made the window glass look like it had been painted with frost. She passed me a sandwich and smiled without saying anything for a few seconds. I waited. Then she told me about her ex-husband, not bitterly, but like she'd practiced telling the story in a way that didn't feel like a wound anymore. She said they married young, built a life they thought would last, but somewhere in their 40s, they realized they were just roommates playing house. No big drama, just an ache that wouldn't go away. It wasn't pity I felt listening to her. It was something else. Admiration, maybe. She spoke with such clarity, like someone who had done the work of understanding herself. That kind of self-awareness isn't common. When I got back to painting after lunch, the room felt different. Wasn't just adding color to walls anymore, was participating in something. A transition, maybe even a healing. That might sound dramatic, but you'd be surprised how often home improvement coincides with personal evolution. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot too. Now back to the story. She stepped in around my mid-afternoon to check on my progress. I was working on a section near the ceiling, and she tilted her head to look up, arms crossed, lips pursed slightly as if she were deciding whether she liked it or not. Then, almost out of nowhere, she said, "I haven't painted anything in years, not since I stopped teaching." I asked why, without really thinking about it. She shrugged. Life got messy. It started to feel like a luxury I couldn't afford not. In money, just in time and space. I handed her the roller. "Right. Want to try a stroke?" She hesitated, looked at the paint on the wall, then at me, then back at the roller. She took it, dipped it lightly in the tray, and rolled it across the lower portion of the wall with surprising steadiness. Then she handed it back and smiled, not a big smile, but a quiet one. The kind that says, "I didn't know I needed that." By the time I packed up, the kitchen looked brighter. Not just from the fresh coat of paint, but from something else, some kind of shared energy that had started building between us. She walked me to the door again, leaning against the frame, with one foot curled behind the other. She thanked me not just for the work, but for the company. That's how she said it. "Thanks for the company." I nodded and gave her a small wave before heading down the path toward my truck. But just before I opened the door, she called out, "Ben? Da-da-da-da-da-da-da! You? Said you like doing projects that leave a mark? Think this one's going to stay with you?" I looked at her for a moment, taking in the way the porch light hit her auburn hair and the faint paint stain on her sleeve. "Yeah," I said. "I think it might." That night I didn't even try to distract myself. I let the memory of the day wash over me, her voice replaying in my head like a song you didn't know you liked until it was stuck there.
Oh.
Something had started. I didn't know what, but I knew it was going to change me. Friday came with the promise of sunlight and a clear sky, a welcome shift from the quiet drizzle of the previous day. I pulled up to Eliza's place right as the morning light began to stretch its way over the rooftops. The early golden hue made the yellow paint on her house glow just a little brighter, like it belonged in a magazine about the best-kept secrets in small-town living. The kitchen project was nearing its end, and I told myself this would probably be my last full day there. I should have felt that familiar satisfaction that comes with a job wrapping up cleanly, but I didn't. Instead, I felt a subtle kind of restlessness, a sense that something was unfinished, not on the walls, but in the air between us. When she opened the door, she was barefoot, holding 2 mugs of coffee, as if she had known exactly when I'd arrive. Her hair was down for the first time since I met her, wavy and brushing just past her shoulders. She didn't say anything at first, just handed me the coffee, smiled softly, and walked back inside. It wasn't flirtatious. It was something quieter, more intentional, like the kind of silence you share with someone after a long conversation. That didn't need words to keep going. The kitchen looked even better now that the sun was streaming through the windows. The mint green walls shimmered gently, catching the light just enough to feel alive. She had moved some of her artwork into the room's small, colorful canvases she said she'd painted years ago when she used to teach. I hadn't even realized how empty the walls had felt without them until they were there. As I unpacked my tools and laid out the supplies for the final touches, I noticed her moving through the room differently, more slowly, like she was soaking it all in. Every time I caught a glimpse of her watching me, there was a softness in her gaze. It's like something unspoken had settled quietly between us over the past 2 days. The hours passed steadily. We didn't talk as much that morning, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was like we were both aware that something delicate was forming, and neither of us wanted to speak too loudly in case it shattered. At one point, she offered to help me clean some of the trim lines, saying she'd done enough brushwork in her teaching days to still know her way around a paint can. I handed her a small brush, and we worked side by side for nearly half an hour, without saying a word, but in that silence, there was so much. The brush of her arm near mine, the soft sound of her breathing as she concentrated, the occasional glance we exchanged when our hands bumped or moved too closely together. None of it was intentional, but all of it was felt. After lunch, she disappeared. For a bit, and I kept working. I was finishing the backsplash wall when she returned wearing a different outfit: jeans, a white linen shirt, and the slightest touch of lipstick. She caught me looking, and for a second, I thought she might call me out on it. But she didn't. She just smiled, walked to the window, said the kitchen finally looked like a place she could breathe in again. Then she asked if I'd stay for dinner. It's just a simple meal, nothing fancy, she said. She'd been cooking less for herself lately and thought it might be nice to share a meal with someone who appreciated the space now as much as she did. I hesitated, not because I didn't want to, but because I wasn't sure what it meant. It wasn't professional protocol to dine with clients, but Eliza didn't feel like a client anymore. She felt like something else, something in between, a stranger and something closer, something waiting to be named. I agreed. She seemed almost surprised, like she hadn't expected me to say yes. She offered to cook while I finished the last few edges, and I could hear her moving around behind me in the adjoining room pans clinking. Cupboards opening, the faint sound of a playlist she had put on low volume in the background. Something acoustic, warm, and nostalgic. When I finished, I washed up in the bathroom, down the hall, and returned to find the kitchen completely transformed. Not just from the paint, but from the way she'd set the table to place settings with mismatched plates, a bottle of wine in the center, and a small candle flickering softly between us. She had prepared roasted vegetables, grilled chicken, and something that smelled like homemade bread. It was simple, but intimate. It felt like being invited into a memory. We ate slowly, talked more. Next, she asked about my family, my travels. The reason I got into this kind of work? Told her the truth, that I liked how tangible it was, that I could see something broken and make it whole again. I never liked sitting behind a desk, that I preferred the rhythm of work that involved my hands and heart at the same time. She listened with the kind of attention that made you feel like every word mattered. Then she told me about the first time she ever painted anything. She was 9, sitting in her grandmother's kitchen, painting the flower pots with watercolors while her grandmother made tea. That moment stuck with her, she said. Not because the art was good, but because it made her feel seen as the meal wound down. And the sun dipped lower through the window, she grew quiet. There was a pause in our conversation that felt heavier than usual. She looked down at her wine glass, then back at me, and her voice lowered slightly. Do you think, she said slowly, that age really changes how people feel about each other? I didn't answer right away. I could feel the question hanging. They're charged with more than just curiosity. She didn't need a lecture or a polite dismissal. She needed honesty. I told her that age might change a few things, like routines, perspectives, maybe even priorities, but that it didn't change the way someone made you feel when you looked at them. That spark, that connection, that pull-it had nothing to do with calendars. She held my gaze for a long moment, and then she nodded. Not as if she agreed, but as if she had heard exactly what she needed to hear. We cleaned up together, slowly. Quietly, the kind of quiet that isn't uncomfortable, but sacred. When I finally said goodnight and walked out to my truck, I felt something in me shift, like the job wasn't just done, like something had just begun. Saturday felt different. The moment I woke up, I wasn't scheduled to return to Eliza's house that day. Technically, the job was finished. I'd already packed up my tools and had no practical reason to go back. But there was this quiet pull in my chest, like something had been left mid-sentence. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, not the work, not the connection, not the space we'd carved out between ourselves over the past few days. I found myself going over the details of the last night again, and again the way her eyes held on to mine a little too long after I answered her question about age. The small flicker of something behind her smile, like she was holding a door, open just enough to be seen, but not enough to be reached. I told myself I'd just swing by to drop off a thank you note. Maybe bring her a small plant for the kitchen, a little closure gift for the space we'd revived together. I even stopped at a local nursery and picked out a small pothos in a terracotta pot, thinking it would match the gentle green of her newly painted walls. It was a flimsy excuse, but it was enough to get me behind the wheel and headed back to Clearwater Springs. When I arrived, it was just after 10. The sun was already warming the front of her house, and the porch glowed like a still frame from a movie. I sat in my truck for a minute, trying to decide if this was a good idea, if I was crossing some line. But then the front door opened as if she'd sensed I was there, and Eliza stepped out with a slightly surprised look that melted. into something softer when she saw me holding the plant. She didn't say anything right away, just stood there for a second, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear and smiling in that quiet way of hers that never felt rehearsed. I told her I just wanted to thank her for the meals, the company, the conversation, and she laughed lightly, saying she should be the one thanking me for turning her kitchen into a place she could actually enjoy being in again. She stepped aside and invited me in without hesitation. The kitchen looked even better with the sunlight flooding through, the green walls brightening the room like a breath of fresh air. She placed the pothos on the windowsill and stepped back, nodding approvingly. Then she looked at me for a beat, longer than necessary, like she was measuring something. She asked if I had time for tea. I did, or at least I told myself I did. We sat in the breakfast nook, the same place we'd shared sandwiches and wine. And this time the air between us felt both familiar and loaded with questions neither of us had asked yet. We talked about little things at first. She mentioned a manuscript she was editing for a young author who had no concept of sentence structure. And I told her about a painting job I had coming up in a retirement home that would likely turn into a week of unsolicited life advice. But beneath the humor, I could feel this quiet tug in the atmosphere, like something was trying to rise to the surface, and neither of us wanted to be the first to bring it up then. Almost like she'd been waiting for a breath to fall in. The right place. She said she had a question, something she'd been thinking about since our last conversation. I could see the vulnerability in her posture, the way her hands wrapped around the mug just a bit tighter, the way her eyes didn't meet mine right away. She asked if I thought people could start over not just in theory, but in the middle of life, after everything you thought would be permanent had changed. I paused, not because I didn't have an answer, but because I knew how much she needed the truth. I told her that starting over wasn't about forgetting what came before. It was about learning how to carry it differently. That sometimes you didn't get to rewrite the story, but you could pick up the pen and write the next chapter in your own handwriting. Her shoulders relaxed a little after that. She said she liked the way I phrased things. That I had this way of talking like I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I told her I'd had enough years of trying to impress people that I finally realized it never left me feeling any fuller. We sat there for a while, drinking tea that had long gone cold. She told me more about her life, how, after her divorce, she stayed in the house mostly out of inertia, not sentiment. That she thought about selling it once, but the idea of packing everything up alone was too overwhelming. She told me how quiet the house felt after years of shared footsteps, and how sometimes the sound of silence after dinner felt heavier than any argument she'd ever had. It wasn't dramatic, just honest, and that honesty made the space feel sacred. Like we'd stepped into a version of reality where nothing had to be sugar-coated, and that was enough to feel safe. Then she asked if I wanted to stay for lunch. This time, I didn't hesitate. Moved around the kitchen like we had done it for years, me slicing vegetables, her stirring soup on the stove, our bodies moving in tandem without much direction. At one point, our hands brushed while reaching for the same spoon, and we both paused, neither of us pulling away too quickly. Her eyes met mine, and something settled between us. Something warm. Something neither of us named. We ate in near silence, but it was the kind of silence that felt earned. Like we didn't need to speak, because we were both aware of the weight of what was happening. She asked about the kind of person I usually dated, and I gave her a half smile, saying I hadn't had much time for dating lately, that I was still figuring things out. I wasn't exactly the guy who planned things years ahead. Then she said it, not with hesitation or fear, but with the kind of openness that comes from reaching a point in life where you're done pretending. She asked, "Would you date someone who's 45?" It was said plainly. Not with flirtation, not fishing for a compliment, just a question, rooted in genuine curiosity and maybe a touch of longing. I didn't answer right away, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wanted her to see that I was thinking about it, not reacting, but considering. I looked at her, really looked at her, and what I saw wasn't age. It wasn't numbers. It wasn't the years that separated us or the assumptions that came with them. What I saw was Eliza, a woman who was unafraid to ask the question out loud. a woman who still knew how to laugh. With her whole face, who'd lived enough to carry her pain without letting it harden her. And I realized then that it was never about whether or not I would date someone who was 45. It was about whether or not I'd met someone who made me want to. The question lingered in the air long after it was spoken, as if time itself paused to let it echo across the freshly painted kitchen walls. Would I date someone who's 45? Should have been a simple question, one with a yes or no answer. But the truth of it pressed against more than just surface-level attraction or idle curiosity. Eliza wasn't asking me to flatter her. She was asking something deeper, whether I saw her as someone still worth wanting, someone still capable of being chosen, not out of kindness or politeness, but out of genuine desire. And I felt the weight of that. Not because she was older than me, she wasn't by much, but because I understood, in my own quiet way, what it meant to live long enough to question your own worth in the eyes of another. I didn't rush my answer, and she didn't press. Instead, she leaned back slightly in her chair, her hands folded gently in her lap, her eyes focused somewhere near the base of the windowsill where the pothos now lived, reaching lazily toward the light. I watched her in that moment, the way her jaw tightened subtly, the way her breath caught and then settled again, as if bracing herself for an answer she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. I told her that age was never the thing I measured when I connected with someone, that I'd met 25-year-olds with no emotional depth and 50-year-olds who could disarm me with a glance. I told her I believed in resonance, in that quiet alignment between two people that wasn't dictated by time or expectations, but by how it felt to simply be near each other. She looked at me then, really looked, and her eyes softened. She didn't smile right away. She didn't need to. It was a kind of relief, not celebration of breath she'd been holding that she could finally let go of. We didn't talk about it again that day. She didn't revisit the question, and I didn't bring it up. But everything after that moment felt slightly altered, as if we had crossed an invisible threshold. We moved around the house for the next hour with an ease that hadn't been there before, like we'd stepped into a quiet agreement that something between us had changed, and we were both allowing it to unfold naturally. It wasn't romantic in a traditional sense. There were no declarations, no impulsive touches. Just a sense of awareness, the kind that settles between people when they start seeing each other, not just as company, but as possible. Eventually. I stood to leave. It was early afternoon by then, and though I had no other job scheduled that day, I felt a strange need to give the moment space to breathe. Too much closeness, too soon, might blur the edges of what had just taken shape between us. She walked me to the door again, this time with her arms crossed over her chest, the wind tugging lightly at her shirt. We exchanged a few words about the weekend. Nothing significant, but as I turned to go, she touched my arm gently and asked if I might want to come back the following day for coffee. Maybe brunch. She said it without a trace of pretense, just a quiet invitation. I told her I'd like that. The drive home was quieter than usual. Even though the roads were busy and the local radio station was playing its usual stream of forgettable pop songs, I didn't turn it off, but I barely heard it. My thoughts were drifting, circling around the space we'd created in her kitchen, replaying the question again and again. Would I date a 45-year-old woman? It wasn't just about age. It was about how people evolve, how they carry their pasts, how they look at you when they're no longer pretending to be someone else. Eliza had a steadiness that came from knowing herself. She didn't perform her vulnerability, she simply lived it. With grace and a kind of quiet courage that stirred something in me I hadn't felt in a long time, that night I sat on my back porch with a beer in hand, staring out at the neighbor's oak tree swaying in the dusk. I thought about all the times I'd tried to force connections that weren't meant to last. Relationships built on attraction or convenience, or the desperate need to feel less alone. None of them had lasted. None of them had felt like what I'd felt sitting across from Eliza as she asked that question. There was something about her that grounded me, not in a dramatic, cinematic way, just in a way that made everything else feel a little less noisy. Sunday morning arrived with golden light streaming through my bedroom window. I got up, showered, dressed casually, and without overthinking it, drove back to Clearwater Springs. When I arrived at her house, she was already outside, sitting on the porch with a book in one hand and a cup of tea in the other. She looked up as I pulled in, her face breaking into a smile that was softer than the morning sun. She waved me over and asked if I liked French toast. I told her I did. She stood, opened the screen door, and said, "Good, I made extra." Inside, the kitchen smelled like cinnamon and warm butter. There was a skillet on the stove, syrup in a small pitcher, and a pair of mismatched mugs waiting by the sink. We moved easily together again, like two people who had done this 100 times before, plated the food while I poured the coffee. And we sat at the table like we belonged there, as if the room itself had rearranged to accommodate whatever was blooming between us. We ate slowly. We laughed about something trivial, the way the bread had crisped a little too much on one side, or how I always seemed to spill coffee no matter how careful I was. Then we talked about real things, dreams we used to have, jobs we didn't take, places we thought we'd live. She told me she once considered moving to a small town in Vermont to open a used bookstore with a coffee shop inside. I told her. I once considered selling everything and driving across the country, painting murals on old barns. Neither of us did those things, but talking about them made us feel like we could have. Like there were still parts of ourselves we hadn't fully given up on. After brunch, she asked if I'd help her move a shelf into the kitchen. She'd been meaning to install it for months, but had never gotten around to it. We spent the next hour measuring, drilling, and leveling, our hands brushing occasionally, our laughter filling the quiet moments. When it was done, she stood back and nodded, satisfied. Then she looked at me, her expression shifting into something more serious, and said, "This is the first time in a long time this house has felt like mine." And I understood, not because of the shelf or the paint or the new pothos plant by the window, but because it had become a space she had reshaped in her own image with her choices, her voice, her presence, in some small way. I had become part of that. We didn't talk about dating again that day. We didn't need to, because everything we did spoke louder than words. The invitations, the trust, the shared silences. It was all there, wrapped in the subtle gestures that build something real. Something that doesn't need to be named right. Away, because both people already feel it growing by Monday morning. The weekend felt like something pulled from a quiet dream and folding in slow, careful layers and stitched together with gestures too subtle to explain to anyone else. It wasn't just what had happened, but the way it had happened. Nothing was rushed, nothing demanded. And yet, the warmth lingered in me well into the following day, to the way a familiar song lingers long after the last note has faded. I had other jobs scheduled, and they pulled me back into the rhythm of sanding, priming, painting, and hauling ladders from one address to another. But I caught myself drifting often, wondering what Eliza was doing, how the light looked in her kitchen at different hours, and whether the pothos we'd set near the window had started to trail yet. It was ridiculous. I told myself how quickly someone could settle into the back of your thoughts with so little effort. I didn't text her that day, didn't call. Something in me wanted to let what we had over the weekend breathe without crowding. I wanted her to know that the connection we were building wasn't based on convenience or the intensity of a few shared meals. It was something slower, steadier. So I went about my day, but with that undercurrent of awareness that the next time I saw her, things wouldn't feel quite the same. Not because they had changed in a dramatic way, but because we had both crossed some invisible line where uncertainty began to feel more like possibility. Tuesday morning. I was just wrapping up a patio job for a client on the north side of town when I got her message. It was simple. "Hope your week's going well. Made too many lemon bars. Want to help me fix that problem?" I smiled like a fool right there in the driveway. She didn't need to be clever or poetic. It was her way of reaching out, soft and easy, without pressure. I replied that I'd stop by later that afternoon if she was free. She sent a thumbs up emoji. Just that. When I arrived, she was on her hands and knees, rearranging books on a low shelf in her living room. She looked up, a bit flushed from moving around, and laughed at herself, saying she got into one of those random organizing moods and now couldn't stop. There were stacks of paperbacks on the floor, little ceramic knickknacks scattered across the coffee table, and a half-empty glass of iced tea sweating on a coaster nearby. It was chaotic but oddly charming. I offered to help and she waved me off, saying she wasn't about to make me organize her impulse bookstore purchases from the past 15 years. But she did offer me a lemon bar, which I accepted immediately. Sat on the rug surrounded by the mess, eating sticky lemon bars and talking about nothing in particular, the movies we liked, the books we meant to read, the way neither of us had figured out how to keep succulents alive. It felt domestic in the most unexpected way. Like we'd skipped the awkward small talk phase and dropped right into something honest, comfortable. I noticed how easily I laughed around her. Not forced, not polite, but the kind of laughter that curled up from your chest before you had time to filter it. Eventually, she picked up a dusty hardcover and turned it over in her hands. She told me it had been a gift from her ex-husband, said it used to mean something, but now she wasn't sure. If she kept it out of nostalgia or habit, she placed it in a pile marked "Donate without ceremony." I watched her do it with this mix of admiration and curiosity. It wasn't about the book. It was about the way she allowed herself to let go of things without bitterness. There was no spite in her actions, no regret, just a quiet acceptance that some things and some people don't get to stay forever. It doesn't make their presence any less real. As we worked our way through the stack, she told me more about her ex. Not with resentment, but with the clarity of someone who'd had time to process. They'd met young, married fast, and spent years trying to mold themselves into the people they thought the other needed. Eventually, they realized they were more roommates than partners. The divorce had been civil, but emotionally exhausting. What stuck with her the most, she said, was how invisible she had started to feel toward the end, like someone he lived with, not someone he looked at. And though she didn't say it out loud, I understood. It's the way she'd asked me that question in the kitchenette wasn't just curiosity. It was a search for confirmation that she was still visible, still worth noticing, still seen. I didn't try to fix anything or offer advice. I just listened. And in doing so, I felt the quiet draw of something deeper forming between us. Not pity, not infatuation, but understanding, respect, and maybe the early bloom of affection that couldn't quite be named yet. We didn't hug when I left that day. She simply walked me to the door and said she was glad I came. I told her I was too, and that was it. No dramatics, just a thread stretched a little tighter between us. The rest of the week passed like that. Soft check-ins, a shared coffee, a photo she sent me of the shelf we'd installed, now holding a few favorite cookbooks and a little ceramic bird she'd found in a thrift store. The kind of slow, steady unfolding that didn't demand labels or promises, just presence. But on Friday, something unexpected happened that shifted the rhythm. I was working a job at a rental property across town when I noticed someone pull up next to my truck. I didn't recognize the car at first, but when the driver stepped out, I saw that it was Jules, my ex. She had moved back to the area a few months ago after a stint out west, and we hadn't spoken much since the breakup. Not because of animosity, but because we had simply unraveled in the way people do when the glue holding them together weakens under the weight of daily indifference. She said she'd seen my truck and figured she'd say hi. I kept it cordial. Asked how she was, what brought her back. She told me she was teaching again, living closer to her parents. Her voice was the same measured, polite, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a trace of nostalgia, maybe even recognition. Before she left, she asked if I wanted to grab a coffee sometime. No pressure, she said. Just catching up. I didn't give her an answer, not because I was tempted, but because the question caught me off guard. For a moment I wondered what Eliza would think if she knew. It's not in a possessive way, but in the way people start to wonder how new connections can be colored by old stories. That night, I lay in bed thinking about it. Not about Jules, but about how fragile timing can be. How the past always seems to knock just when the present is beginning to feel promising. And I realized something important. I didn't want to revisit what I had with Jules, not because it was painful, but because it felt like an entirely different version of me. And I was starting to like the version of me who laughed over lemon bars and installed crooked shelves in sunlit kitchens. The following morning brought with it the kind of chill that hinted at the changing season, The skies over Clearwater Springs were streaked with slow-moving clouds, and the light felt softer than usual, diffused in a way that made everything seem a little quieter, a little more fragile. I brewed a cup of coffee and sat on the back steps of my house, cradling the warmth between my palms while my thoughts, uninvited but persistent, returned to that brief exchange with Jules. There wasn't anything dramatic about the conversation. No old sparks, no aching regret. Timing unsettled me. Not because I missed her, I didn't, but because her sudden appearance felt like the past reaching out, trying to reclaim space in a present that wasn't meant for it. I thought about how easy it would be to slip back into something familiar, even if it didn't fit anymore. That's the dangerous thing about history. It wears grooves into your memory, and when you're uncertain, those grooves feel safe. But safety doesn't always mean it's right. Jules had been part of a different chapter, a version of me who hadn't yet learned the quiet power of stillness, who mistook busyness for meaning and routine for love. I wasn't that man anymore. The more time I spent with Eliza, the more I began to see the difference. Still, I didn't mention the run into her. It wasn't out of guilt, there was nothing to confess. But it felt unnecessary to invite a ghost into something that was still taking shape. Besides, she had a way of sensing things without being told. Eliza noticed shifts in energy the way some people noticed weather patterns. And when I saw her again later that day, I caught a flicker of something in her expression that told me she could feel my mind was elsewhere. She didn't push. She never did. Instead, she handed me a cup of herbal tea and invited me to sit on her porch swing. The afternoon was warm, with just enough breeze to keep the heat from pressing down too hard. We rocked in slow, uneven intervals, letting the silence settle between us like a blanket. Eventually, she asked how my week had gone, and I told her honestly that it had been busy, a little odd, and that I'd run into someone from my past. Her eyes didn't narrow. She didn't lean in like she was searching for scandal. She just nodded and sipped her tea, waiting to see what I'd offer beyond that. I told her about Jules, about the coffee offer, and how I hadn't responded. Not because I didn't want to be rude, but because I didn't want to open a door I had already closed. Eliza didn't interrupt. She listened the way she always did, quietly, attentively, without judgment. When I finished, she looked at me and said, "You don't owe me an explanation, Ben. But thank you for giving me one anyway." And that was it. No jealousy, no interrogation, just grace. That quiet kind of trust that doesn't need to be earned in grand gestures, only in consistent honesty. We sat there for a while longer, talking about smaller things, how her editor had sent over a manuscript with so many grammatical errors. It looked like a different language. How she was considering painting her front door a deep navy blue. How the birds that nested in the gutter above her porch had returned for the third spring in a row. It was in those small stories, those tiny windows into her world, that I found myself sinking deeper. Not because they were extraordinary, but because she trusted me enough to share them. At one point, she stood up and went inside, returning with an old photo album. The cover was worn, the binding frayed, but she held it like it was something sacred. She sat beside me again and flipped it open, turning pages filled with yellowed snapshots and handwritten dates in fading ink. There were photos of her as a child, barefoot in a backyard garden, of her in college with hair dyed a fiery red, of her wedding day, standing beside a man I assumed was her ex-husband, both of them laughing, mid-motion, their joy frozen in time. She didn't narrate the photos. She just let them speak for themselves, occasionally offering a soft chuckle or a wistful sigh. Then she paused on one photo in particular, a candid shot of her at a beach, sunglasses on, smile wide, with the sun glinting off her shoulders. "That was the last time I remember feeling completely at ease," she said quietly. "Like nothing was expected of me, except to exist." I looked at her then, the version of her beside me, and the one frozen in the picture, and realized that, somehow, she carried both within her. The woman who had lived so many lives, and the one still learning how to simply be seen. I asked her if she ever felt like she was still that woman in the photo. She gave a small shrug, the kind that held equal parts honesty and weariness. "Some days," she said, but most days, I feel like I'm trying to remember how to be her. It wasn't sadness exactly. It was something quieter than that. A kind of longing wrapped in self-awareness. And I found myself wishing I could help her find that ease, again, not by changing who she was, but by making space for her to be all the versions of herself without needing to choose one. That evening, as I helped her bring the photo album inside, she turned to me and said, "Oh, I want you to feel like you have to walk on eggshells around me. I know I come with a past. I know 45 doesn't come without baggage." I stopped her right there, told her we all come with something. That it's not about whether someone has baggage, but whether you're willing to help them carry it. Her eyes glossed for a moment, not enough to fall, but enough to blur the edges on. She nodded like she'd been waiting years to hear someone say that out loud later that night. After I'd gone home and washed the paint off my hands, from another job site, I stared at my phone and thought about texting her. Not because I had anything urgent to say, but because I wanted her to know that even when I wasn't beside her, I was still with her in some small way. I typed out a message, still thinking about that beach photo.
Oh.
"You're still that woman, you know? Just wiser now." I hesitated before hitting send, unsure if it crossed a line or if it was too much, too soon. But I sent it anyway. Her reply came almost immediately, single heart emoji. And that was enough. The morning air on Saturday felt unusually still, like the world was holding its breath. I'd woken up earlier than usual, before the sun had fully risen, and just lay there staring at the ceiling, thinking. It wasn't nerves. Exactly. More like anticipation mixed with uncertainty, a strange cocktail of emotions that didn't have a name. Eliza and I had loosely talked about me coming by again that weekend she'd mentioned, maybe sorting through her old pantry cabinets and organizing them manned while it wasn't framed as anything special. Something about it felt weighted now. The more we allowed this quiet closeness to grow between us, the more aware I became of how easily it could shift. How fragile even the most promising connections could feel when your heart had been bruised before. I arrived just after 9. The driveway was shaded and empty of any movement, but the front door was cracked slightly open. I knocked once out of habit before stepping inside. The scent of cinnamon and something citrusy hit me right away, along with the familiar creak of the wooden floors that had become oddly comforting over the past few weeks. I found her in the kitchen, hair pulled up in a messy bun, barefoot, wearing a simple blue sundress that somehow made her look even more effortlessly beautiful than when she tried. She glanced up from the counter, where she was slicing oranges, into a bowl, and offered me a warm, if slightly distracted, smile. We fell into our usual rhythm, chatting casually while working, her passing me jars of spices and me lining up canned goods in neat little rows. She teased me when I insisted on organizing things alphabetically. I poked fun at the expired cans of beans from 2018 that she swore she was saving for emergencies. But beneath the humor and ease, I could sense something slightly off. Her laugh was just a beat slower. Her gaze lingered a little longer than usual before darting away. At first, I chalked it up to tiredness or a rough morning, but by the time we were sitting on the back porch sipping lemonade, the silence between us had taken on a different kind of texture, not tense, but hesitant. Finally, I asked if everything was okay. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked out toward the yard, where sunlight filtered through the leaves in shifting patterns, and took a slow breath. Then she said something that caught me off guard in its content, but in its honesty. "I'm scared I'm making a fool of myself," she said softly. "Letting myself believe something is growing here when maybe you're just being kind." I didn't respond right away. Her voice wasn't accusing. It was vulnerable, fragile in the way people sound when they've carried something alone for a while and finally let it spill. Shifted in my seat, unsure of how to offer comfort without sounding like I was trying to fix something. The truth was, I understood that fear more than I wanted to admit. I'd felt it before in different ways, in different rooms. The fear that what you felt wasn't reciprocated, that the connection you cherished might only be real in your own mind. I told her gently that I wasn't here out of politeness. I didn't spend my free time organizing pantries for just anyone, but I also admitted I was moving carefully not because I didn't care, but because I did. That the closer I got to her, the more aware I became of how much was at stake. I wasn't trying to play it cool or keep things casual. I just didn't want to rush something that deserved to unfold naturally. She nodded, her expression softening, but still uncertain. It's hard, she said. Being at this stage in life and wondering if people see you as a person or just as potential heartbreak. I reached for her hand. It wasn't something I'd done before, deliberately, not with meaning, but in that moment, it felt like the only thing to do. She let me, her fingers curling slowly around mine. You're not a placeholder, Eliza. I said, you're not an in-between or a maybe later. If I'm here, it's because I want to be. That seemed to settle something in her, even if only partially. But the vulnerability of that moment hung in the air for the rest of the day, like the scent of cut grass, faint, persistent, impossible to ignore. We spent the next hour sorting through more cabinets, sharing stories about the worst meals we'd ever cooked. But every now and then, I'd catch her looking at me with that same flicker of uncertainty, like she wasn't quite convinced this wasn't going to end the way so many things in her life had, quietly, with someone walking away. Later in the afternoon, we stepped out to a small local market that set up every weekend in the park near the town square. It was something she used to do on her own, but she asked if I wanted to come along, and I said yes, without hesitation. The market was busy, but not overwhelming. Stalls of handmade candles, fresh produce, local honey, and used books stretched along a gravel path winding through tall oaks. We walked slowly, shoulder to shoulder, pausing at booths and occasionally buying something unnecessary. She bought a small tin of lavender lip balm. I bought a wooden keychain shaped like a paintbrush. At one stall, we stopped to admire a set of framed watercolors, and the vendor, an older woman with bright eyes, smiled and said, "You two make a beautiful couple." Eliza's cheeks flushed, and for the first time that day, she laughed without hesitation. It was small, but I held on to that moment like a spark in the dark. On the way back to her house, she was quieter again, not withdrawn, just reflective. She told me about a friend of hers who had recently started dating again after years of being single. How it was equal parts hopeful and terrifying. She said it feels like learning to swim again after forgetting how, Eliza said. That's sort of how I feel right now, like I'm in deep water, and some days I float, and some days I flail. I told her that I wasn't trying to be a lifeboat, but maybe just someone swimming beside her. That seemed to land somewhere deep, and she squeezed my hand gently before letting go. Back at her house, I helped her unload the few things we bought, then lingered in the doorway longer than I meant to. There was something in the air that made it hard to leave. Something that felt incomplete about just saying goodbye after a day like that. But neither of us moved. We stood there, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the floor. And in that stillness, I saw all the things she wasn't saying, the fear, the hope, the deep ache to trust again. I told her I'd see her tomorrow, and as I turned to go, she said quietly, almost to herself, "I hope you mean that." I did, and yet I knew, even in the warmth of our slow burning connection, that sometimes the hardest thing about falling for someone isn't the fall itself. It's trusting that when you land, they'll still be there. Sunday came with gray skies and the low hum of rain against the rooftops. It had been dry for nearly 2 weeks straight, so the downpour brought a kind of welcome calm. The kind that makes everything move a little slower, makes you want to stay indoors and let the world soften around the edges. I woke to the rhythmic tapping of droplets against my bedroom window and lay still for a while, listening. It was the kind of day that begged for stillness, no errands, no noise, no rush, just time. And I had planned to spend it with Eliza. We'd talked vaguely about continuing some work in the guest room she wanted to convert into an office. Maybe paint the walls a light sage green. Maybe rearrange some furniture. Nothing urgent. Just an excuse to spend more time in each other's orbit. But somewhere between making coffee and answering a couple of overdue client emails, I got pulled into an unexpected job. One of my older clients, a retired veteran who lived alone, called. In a mild panic about a leaky ceiling, said he noticed a soft spot above his kitchen light and didn't trust himself to go up in the attic anymore. He wasn't pushy, just anxious, and I couldn't say no. I told him I'd swing by in an hour and take a look. It was supposed to be quick. I sent Eliza a message before I left. Hey, quick detour. Got a roof issue to check on. Shouldn't take too long, we'll call after. She didn't reply immediately, which I figured meant she was still asleep or reading or maybe working on something around the house. I didn't think much of it, but the job took longer than I expected. Leak had spread farther than my client realized, soaking into insulation, creeping down a wall cavity. I got caught in the fixatic work, patching, and a tarp installation to hold things over until the rain cleared. By the time I looked at my phone again, it was after 3. I had missed 3 messages from Eliza, all time-stamped about Anne, hour apart. The first was simple, no worries, let me know when you're on your way. The second, a bit more hesitant, still okay for today? The third, just one line, guess plans changed. I felt a knot twist in my stomach. I should have checked sooner. Should have called. I sent her a message right away apologizing for the delay and explaining the situation, but there was no response. Not right away, and not later that evening either. I tried calling around 5, but it rang twice and went to voicemail. I didn't leave one. I told myself she was probably just tired, that she needed space, that I was overthinking it. But the truth was I knew I'd stumbled into one of her old wounds, even if I hadn't meant to. On Monday, I kept my distance. Not out of avoidance, but to give her breathing room. I sent one more message that morning, short, sincere. I'd still really like to see you. When you're ready, I'm here. Then I let the silence hold its shape. It wasn't until Tuesday that she responded, and even then it wasn't through. Text, I was finishing up a drywall job on the west side of town when I got a knock on my truck window. I looked up to see her standing there, damp from a light mist, wearing that faded olive raincoat she'd worn the day we met. I rolled the window down, heart suddenly in my throat. Hey, she said, eyes tired but not cold. Can we talk? I sat in the cab of the truck for almost an hour. She didn't yell, didn't accuse, but she was honest achingly so. She told me how the silence after my delay didn't just frustrate her, it echoed. Echoed old patterns, old absences, people who said they'd show up and didn't, who always had something more important to tend to. She said she didn't want to punish me for something I didn't mean, but that part of Hertha part that had spent years building walls just to feel safe had flinched. I listened, let her speak. And when she was done, I told her what I should have. Told her on Sunday that I was sorry. That I wasn't trying to disappear. That I saw her, and I cared more than I probably let on. And most importantly, that she wasn't a placeholder in my schedule. She was someone I thought about even when I wasn't saying anything. Someone whose presence had shifted how I looked at my days. She took that in quietly, turning it over like a stone in her palm, and she asked the question I knew was coming. So where does that leave us, Ben? It was the kind of question that didn't have a clean answer. But I told her I wasn't looking for something casual. That I didn't know exactly where this was headed, but I knew I wanted to keep walking toward it, toward her. That I wasn't afraid of her past, her fears, or the emotional knots she still hadn't unraveled. I just wanted to be someone she didn't have to brace herself around. Her shoulders softened then, just slightly, enough to know something had shifted back toward warmth. We didn't hug, didn't kiss. Just sat there until the rain began to patter more steadily against the windshield. And the silence between us felt less like distance and more like an understanding. She climbed out of the truck a few minutes later, said she'd call me later in the week, and walked off without looking back. But there was no bitterness in her steps, no retreat, just space. And maybe, just maybe, the beginnings of healing. That night, I sat in my living room, the house quiet, the rain continuing its slow march across the rooftops. And I thought about what it meant to care for someone who was still learning how to feel safe. It wasn't about grand gestures or perfect timing. It was about showing up consistently, gently even when things got messy. Even when fears flared up and plans got derailed. And as I stared out the window, watching the water beat against the glass, I realized that I hadn't just stumbled into something meaningful with Eliza. I was choosing it, every day, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. 2 days passed, without a word from Eliza, not silence in the way people use it to punish, but a silence that felt reflective, like she was still sorting through what had been stirred up. I didn't press. I stayed in my rhythm, showing up to work sites, patching drywall, replacing a front porch beam, eating quiet dinners at home. But under that quiet routine, I was carrying a hum of restlessness that didn't leave. I kept checking my phone more than I wanted to admit. I told myself not to, that people needed space and time to think, but the waiting scratched at something old in me too. Some part of me that had learned, through my own years of misplaced trust, that even good things can vanish if you don't hold them gently. On the third evening, just as the sun was beginning to tuck itself behind the line of trees at the edge of town, I heard a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone.
Added.
Barefoot across the floor and opened it, and there she was, Eliza, holding a paper bag in one hand and a folded umbrella in the other. She looked a little windblown, a little unsure, but her smile was soft. And when I stepped aside to let her in, she moved like someone who had made up her mind to stop hiding. "I brought dinner," she said simply, setting the bag on the kitchen counter. "Hope you still like pad thai." I smiled and nodded, and we moved into the kitchen, as if no pause had happened at all. She unpacked the food while I got out plates, and we stood shoulder to shoulder again, like we had so many times before. Except this time, there was something quieter threading between us. Not tension, not distance, just mutual awareness. A shared understanding that we were stepping back into something worth protecting. We ate at the small kitchen table. No music, no TV, just the sound of our forks and the occasional creak of wood beneath our feet. About halfway through the meal, she set her fork down and said, "There's something I haven't told you. Something I've been holding close, because... Well, because I didn't want it to scare you off." I looked up, met her eyes, and waited. She took a breath, long and deliberate, then continued. "Before I moved back here, I was living in New York, working in publishing, mostly editorial management. I was good at it. The job consumed me, honestly. 12-hour days, weekend calls, non-stop deadlines. I built a life around work because I didn't know how to build one around anything else." She paused, eyes flicking to the window like she was watching some old ghost walk by. "And then I got married. His name was Colin. Charming, ambitious, the kind of man who knew how to fill a room. We met at a conference. I thought he saw Marili. Saw me, but what he saw was someone who made him feel important. And I mistook that for love." Her voice didn't shake, but there was a tightness in it, a tension carefully held between each word. I didn't interrupt, just let her speak. "He didn't hit me, not physically. But sometimes the worst bruises are the ones you can't see. He had a way of making me feel small, insignificant, like everything I did was either not enough or too much." I stopped recognizing myself. My laugh became quieter, my steps more careful. I stayed for 6 years. She looked at me then, and for a moment she looked afraid not of me, but of what her story might change in my eyes. I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers, grounding her there. "I left on a Tuesday," she continued, "packed a single suitcase, called a car service, and never looked back. Quit my job 2 weeks later and came here, to this quiet little town with its crickets and peeling paint and no subways. I thought if I could just disappear for a while, I could remember who I was before him." Her hand trembled slightly under mine. I gave it a gentle squeeze. "It's taken me 3 years to feel like I can breathe again. And even now, there are moments, small, stupid ones, where I second-guess everything." "That message you didn't respond to right away? It wasn't about you, Ben. It was about all the other times someone made me feel invisible." I nodded, letting her words settle. "You're not invisible to me, Eliza," I said softly. "Not even for a second." Her eyes welled, but the tears didn't fall. She blinked them back and smiled dry, a little sad but real. "I know. That's why I came." We cleared the plates slowly, lingering in the small spaces between tasks. Washing, drying, putting things away. It wasn't about the dishes, it was about creating rhythm again, reestablishing that sense of shared movement that we'd both started to crave. Even if we hadn't said it out loud, Afterward, we sat on the couch, close but not touching. The quiet hum of a table lamp filling the room with a soft glow. She leaned her head back and let out a sigh that sounded like relief. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, "if the people we become after heartbreak are stronger or just better at pretending?" I thought about that for a moment, then answered, "I think we become more honest, more careful with where we place our hope, but stronger." "Yeah, because choosing to try again, that's not weakness. That's courage." She tilted her head to look at me. "And what about you? What are you still carrying?" The question caught me off guard, not because it was unexpected, but because I hadn't realized how much I'd been avoiding asking it of myself. I told her the truth. About my ex, about the years of surface-level relationships that left me feeling lonelier than being alone ever did, about how I'd buried myself in work, thinking I could sidestep vulnerability if I just stayed too busy to notice what I was missing. "But then you walked into your kitchen with that peach-colored notebook," I said, and reminded me that stillness isn't the enemy. That real connection isn't loud, it's steady. I didn't even realize how much I missed that until you gave it a name. She looked down, then back up. "What name did I give it?" "Home," I said. "You feel like home." This time the tears did fall, quiet, clean, and without apology. I let them come, let her lean gently into my shoulder, and we sat like that for a long time. The quiet between us no longer uncertain, but full of promise. The days that followed, that quiet night in my living room, unfolded with a kind of unspoken agreement between us, one not defined by rules or expectations, but by presence. Eliza didn't need constant reassurance, and I didn't need to over-explain my every movement. We'd passed through a threshold that left both of us changed raw, yes, but more open. She would text me little things throughout the day, a picture of a strange vegetable at the market, a quote she found in one of her old novels, a blurry photo of her coffee cup with the words "I thought of you." I responded in kind, sending snapshots of half-finished repairs. It's an old favorite song playing on the radio. Or simply letting her know when I was heading to lunch in case she wanted to meet. On Thursday morning, we fell into what was quickly becoming a tradition breakfast at her kitchen island while the sunlight angled through the windows. She had on a loose white cardigan, her hair still damp from a shower. And she looked so relaxed that I almost didn't recognize the version of her I'd first met. That woman had carried everything tight in her shoulders and behind her eyes. This woman laughed easily and stirred her coffee slowly, like she wasn't in a rush to be anywhere else. We spent the day working on her garden boxes, something she'd talked about for weeks but never gotten around to. I dug up the soil while she planted herbs, rosemary, thyme, and basil. She knelt beside me in the dirt, not caring about the smudges on her knees, and told me about her grandmother's garden, how they used to make herbal tea from scratch, and how she'd always dreamed of a life slow enough to let things grow. That hit me harder than I expected, the simplicity of it. The clarity of knowing what you want, not in grand terms, but in the smallest, most honest details, by early evening. We were resting on the back steps, arms brushing as we drank lemonade from mason jars, the scent of fresh soil still clinging to us. It was quiet, not the kind of silence that needed filling, but the kind that said everything without a word. That's when my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen and felt a jolt of surprise. It was Yvonne, old friend from my hometown, someone I hadn't seen in years but who had always been a fixture in my early adult life. We'd worked together briefly when I was just starting out. Our bond had been one of those rare, easy friendships that sometimes toe the line of something more without ever quite crossing it. "Hey, I'm in town for a conference," her message read. "Would love to catch up, even just for coffee." I stared at it for a second longer than necessary, not because I was unsure of how to respond, but because I felt Eliza's presence next to Muriel, solid grounding, and I realized how easily a message like that could throw dust into the air. She must have noticed something shift in my posture because she asked, "Everything okay?" I nodded, setting the phone down, screen side down. Just an old friend passing through. "Wants to meet for coffee." She didn't press. Just nodded and looked out across the garden. I caught the faint pull of a thought behind her eyes. It wasn't jealousy. I don't think that's how she worked, but something quieter. Pause. a hesitation. "You should go," she said a moment later, her voice even. "It's good to see people who know the parts of you from before." I appreciated the way she said it. No bitterness, no edge, just understanding. But I also knew enough about Eliza now to realize that sometimes her grace was a shield. Learn to be the bigger person, even when something stung. I texted Ava back, said I could meet her for lunch the next day, then slid the phone back into my pocket. For the rest of the evening, the conversation drifted back to easy topics. What herbs needed the most sunlight? Whether or not her compost bin was doing anything at all, but underneath it all was a small, almost imperceptible shift. A reminder that despite how close we'd grown, there were still parts of our lives that didn't fully belong to each other. Not yet. The next day, I met Ava at a small cafe just off Main Street. She looked exactly the same sharp smile, wind-tousled hair, wearing a faded leather jacket, and the kind of ease that comes from living a life full of motion. We talked about old jobs, people we used to work with, how strange it was that time could stretch and fold without warning. She asked if I was still doing contract work, and when I told her about settling in this smaller town, her eyebrows lifted slightly. "Wow," she said. "You always said you needed to keep moving, or you'd go crazy." I smiled at that. "Turns out stillness isn't so bad," she grinned. "Ah, so there's someone." I didn't deny it. I told her about Eliza carefully, but honestly, about how we'd met, how things had grown slowly, how she wasn't like anyone I'd known before. Ava listened without interrupting, then simply said, "I'm happy for you, Ben. You always needed someone who would meet you where you are instead of trying to change your pace." When I returned to Eliza's place that evening, she was in the kitchen, making soup, her hair up, music playing low from her phone. She turned and gave me a half smile, one that tried to pretend she wasn't bracing herself. "How was coffee?" she asked, not looking at me as she stirred. "Good," I said. "It's familiar in the way that reminds you how much you've changed." That made her pause. She turned to face me fully then, eyes soft. "And did it remind you of something you missed?" "Joel," I said, stepping closer. "It reminded me why I don't miss it." There was a long moment where neither of us moved, where the silence brimmed with possibility. Then she smiled, genuine this time, wide enough to crease the corners of her eyes, and handed me a spoonful of broth to taste. "You're going to want to marry me after this soup," she said lightly. I tasted it, laughed. "Too late, I already do." She rolled her eyes but didn't correct me. And in that moment, with the scent of rosemary and garlic filling the kitchen, I realized something vital. Love doesn't always arrive like a thunderclap. Sometimes it shows up in spoons of soup, in shared soil, and soft smiles after old friends reappear. Sometimes it settles in quietly, so gently you almost don't notice until one day you do. And you can't remember what life felt like before it. The following week unfolded with a sort of quiet steadiness between us. Not the kind that lulls people into complacency, but the kind that felt like we were finally finding our rhythm to separate lives, brushing edges and learning how to move in sync. I found myself reaching for my phone before I even made my morning coffee, wanting to send her a photo of the sunrise through my dusty truck window or a quick joke about something I heard on the radio. She replied just as quickly, often with that dry humor I'd come to appreciate, or sometimes just a single sentence that said more than paragraphs ever could. "Don't forget the world moves slower when you're paying attention." She'd once texted me after I said I was rushing through the day. I reread that line 3 times before responding. One afternoon, as we were sitting on her back porch with mugs of tea in a folding chair I'd brought from my truck, her curled up on a blanket-draped wicker bench, she casually mentioned that her younger sister was coming into town the following weekend. "She hasn't been back since last year," Eliza said, running her finger along the rim of her mug. "Always busy with her job, her husband, her twin boys, but she tries." She glanced at me briefly. "They're doing a small get-together at my mom's place. Backyard kind of thing, just family." There was a pause just long enough for me to catch the shift in her voice. The subtle way people test the waters before asking something slightly vulnerable. She didn't say it outright, but it was there in the silence. So I asked gently, "Are you thinking of going?" She nodded. "Yeah, I haven't been to one in a while. Things with my mom have gotten easier. Another pause. You don't have to come. Just if you wanted to. I wouldn't hate it. It was the first time she'd invited me into a space that extended beyond just the two of us. A space where her past and present intersected, where family history ran deep and sometimes uncomfortable. And I knew what that kind of invitation meant. It wasn't casual. It wasn't just a barbecue. It was a step forward, a glimpse into the life she was rebuilding. And by extension, she was wondering if I might want to be part of that. I'd like to go, said. And the relief in her face was subtle but unmistakable. So, Saturday rolled around with the early bloom of spring in the air. Everything smelled like cut grass and warming earth. I wore my best pair of jeans and a clean button-down, kind I usually reserved for meetings with new clients or holiday dinners back home. When I showed up at her house, Eliza stood on the porch in a soft, blue sundress, hair pinned loosely at the nape of her neck, sunglasses dangling from her fingers. She looked beautiful in a way that didn't try like herself, just more open. The drive to her mother's place was filled with small talk, soft music and the occasional moment of silence that didn't need filling. She seemed calm, but I could tell she was bracing herself. Family gatherings, especially the ones where old expectations sat just below the surface, had a way of stirring up things people thought they'd buried. Her mother's house was a modest ranch-style home with a wide lawn and folding chairs already lining the perimeter of the backyard. Kids were chasing bubbles near the garden beds, adults carrying paper plates with deviled eggs and barbecue, someone shouting instructions over a cornhole game set up by the back fence. The moment we stepped onto the lawn, the air changed. Heads turned, smiles formed, a few eyebrows lifted. Eliza, a woman's voice called. Soon she was pulled into a hug by someone who had her same eyes but a brighter, more effusive energy. Her sister, I guessed. She glanced over at me with curiosity and a slight smirk. And you must be Ben. The introductions followed like a wave. Her mother, stern, but softening with age, greeted me with a brief nod and a tight-lipped smile. Her uncle made a joke about finally seeing Eliza bring someone decent-looking around. And the kids, her nephews, eyed me curiously, like I was a new character in a story they hadn't been told yet. Throughout the afternoon, I floated between conversations, refilling drinks, helping stack cups, talking with her cousin about tools, and home repairs. But every few minutes I'd glance over and find Eliza watching me. It's not in a possessive way, but in a quiet, almost disbelieving way. Like she was still adjusting to what it felt like to have someone on her side in a space she used to walk through alone. At one point, while we stood side by side at the buffet table, she reaching for salad, me grabbing cornbread, she leaned slightly closer and whispered, "This feels weird." "Weird good or weird bad?" I asked. She smiled, dipping a carrot into some hummus. "Weird vulnerable," I nodded. "That's usually where the good stuff starts." Later in the evening, after dessert had been cleared and the sun began slipping behind the tree line, her mother called her over to help bring something out of the garage. Eliza went, leaving me with her sister, who stood beside me, sipping wine from a mason jar. "She's different with you," her sister said quietly. I turned toward her. "In what way?" "Calmer, more settled. She's always been strong. But lately, she looks lighter. Like she doesn't have to hold everything by herself anymore." I didn't know how to respond to that, but I appreciated it. It was a kind of silent endorsement, the kind that didn't need much dressing. When we left that evening, driving back through winding streets and blinking porch lights, Eliza reached over and rested her hand on my knee. She didn't say anything. At first, just stared out at the passing trees. But then, as we hit the turn toward her neighborhood, she said, "Thanks for showing up." That might have been the most important sentence of the day. That night, as we sat on her porch with a shared blanket over our legs and 2 mugs of chamomile tea between us, I realized something had shifted. We weren't just figuring each other out anymore. We were starting to build something with shape, with weight, with memory, and the beauty of it was, neither of us needed to say the word future aloud. We were living it already. The days following the family gathering carried a sense of soft momentum, like we'd reached a new chapter without speaking it aloud. Eliza seemed lighter, less guarded, even playful in ways I hadn't seen before. She'd nudge my arm when I teased her, send me early morning texts with photos of her coffee and a caption that simply read, "Still here," and I without even realizing it had begun carving out space for her in my daily routines. I started picking up extra napkins when I got lunch to go, knowing she'd forget to grab some. I kept her favorite tea stocked in my kitchen. Her laughter had become a fixture in my week, something I missed if I didn't hear it. But change, even the good kind, has a way of rattling the old dust loose. And sometimes, just when things begin to feel solid, our past whispers reminders that not all foundations hold. It started with a simple question I asked one night while we were cleaning up dinner at her place. She'd made chicken piccata and we were loading dishes into the sink together. Sleeves rolled up, elbows bumping. I asked if she'd thought about taking a short trip. Just a weekend away. Nothing grand, maybe a cabin by the lake or one of those cozy little bed and breakfasts in the next town over. The suggestion came out casual, light, the way you ask someone you're dating if they want to check out a new restaurant. But she froze, not dramatically, not in a way most people would notice, but enough that I did. She didn't look up from the plate in her hands, just kept scrubbing as though her attention had glued itself to that single task. Just a thought. I added quickly, not wanting to press. She nodded a little too fast. Maybe. The rest of the night played out normally, her pouring wine, watching a documentary on vintage cameras, her leaning her head on my shoulder. But there was a slight tension, like something had been stirred up and tucked away again before either of us could name it. The next morning, she didn't text me. By noon, I started wondering. By evening, I told myself to give her space. But by the following night, I stopped by her place just to see if everything was okay. She opened the door in sweatpants and a faded t-shirt, no makeup, hair tied back. Still beautiful, but in that worn, tired kind of way that made her look younger and more fragile at once. "Hey," she said, stepping aside to let me in. I didn't ask what was wrong. I knew better. Eliza was someone who needed the room to find her words before offering them. So I sat on the couch, and she sat across from me, legs pulled up underneath her, a blanket bunched at her side. For a few moments, the only sound was the gentle buzz of her refrigerator. "I panicked," she said finally, "about the trip, about everything." I nodded, letting her continue. "It's not that I don't want that with you. I do, more than I expected. But that's what scares me. Wanting this means letting go of that safety net I built around myself. And I don't know if I'm ready to dismantle that just yet." I stayed quiet, giving her space. After Colin, I told myself I wouldn't lose myself in anyone again. That I'd never ask someone to stay. Became really good at being alone, Ben. Like painfully good. I made it my identity, strong, self-sufficient, unshakable. And now, you come along, and you're kind and consistent, and you show up. And instead of that feeling simple, it feels complicated. Because if I let myself lean into this, really lean in, and it falls apart, what does that say about all the strength I built up? What if I haven't healed as much as I thought? Her voice cracked at the end. Not with tears, but with the weight of honesty. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "Eliza, strength isn't about how well you isolate. It's about how well you allow yourself to be seen, Evan, when it scares you. And I don't want you to lose yourself in this. I want you to bring yourself into it. The full, messy, brilliant version of you, okay? And I'll keep showing up, not to fix you or save you, but to walk beside you. She blinked, eyes glistening but resolute. And what if I falter? Then I'll be there when you do. The silence between us then wasn't heavy. It was thick with meaning, filled with the kind of emotion that doesn't need to be polished. After a moment, she slid across the couch and tucked herself under my arm, resting her head against my chest. I felt her exhale against me, kind of breath people release when they stop holding in what hurts. We sat like that for a long time, the blanket drawn over both of us, the room dim but warm. And somewhere in that quiet, I realized that real love doesn't arrive when everything's healed. It doesn't wait for perfect timing or complete certainty. It arrives in the middle of the mess, in the broken spaces still under construction, and says, I'll help you build. That night, she didn't ask me to stay. I didn't ask to leave. We just let the night hold us where we were, two people learning how to stand still in the same storm. And for the first time in a long time, stillness didn't feel scary. The morning after that quiet unraveling on her couch, something subtle had shifted. Not the earth-shaking kind of change. I soughed, but the kind you feel in how someone's shoulders rest a little lower, or how their smile lingers just a few beats longer. Eliza and I didn't talk much that morning, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that comes after a shared truth has been laid bare, unapologetic and no longer heavy. I made her coffee while she sat on the porch. In one of my old flannel shirts, legs tucked under her, mug cradled in both hands like an anchor. When I joined her outside, she didn't say anything at first, just handed me the second mug and leaned into my shoulder. It was early, the sky still bruised with leftover night, and for a long moment we simply watched the world breathe. Later that day, as we were walking through the farmer's market, the sun higher now, and the air filled with that sweet, earthy scent of fresh produce and cut flowers, Eliza stopped by a stall selling handmade soaps and candles. She picked up a tiny tin labeled cedar and ash and held it to her nose, smiling. "Smells like your truck," she said with a small laugh. And for the first time in days, I saw the glint of something carefree in her eyes. That's when I brought it up again. The trip, the cabin. "I know it scared you," I said, watching her examine a jar of wild honey. "But what if we just tried it? Nothing fancy. Just a weekend to unplug and do nothing together. No expectations, no schedule." She looked up. At me, a honey jar still in her hand, and for a second I couldn't read her. Then she surprised me by nodding. "Let's do it." We left that market with a small bag of candles, a loaf of sourdough, and 2 jars of local preserves, and by the next morning, we were driving up toward the lake cabin. I'd booked a modest little place tucked behind a row of pines, with creaky floorboards, mismatched mugs in the cabinets, and a view of the water that made your whole body slow down just by looking at it. Lisa rested her bare feet on the dashboard, sunglasses sliding down her nose, window halfway open so the breeze could tangle her hair. I glanced at her more than once on that drive, trying to memorize what she looked like when she wasn't guarded. When we arrived, she stepped out of the truck and just stood there for a minute, arms folded loosely over her chest, head tilted, as she listened to the wind rustling through the trees. "It's quiet," she said softly. "That's the point," I replied. Inside the cabin, everything was wood walls, ceiling, even the kitchen counters. There was a small fireplace, a couch that sagged in the middle, and a bed covered in an old quilt that smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. She explored it slowly, touching things with her fingertips like she was trying to connect with the years etched into them. "You ever just feel like a place remembers the people who've stayed here before?" she asked while running her hand along the edge of the window pane. "All the time," I said. "But I think it remembers the quiet moments more than the loud ones." That first evening, we cooked pasta together in the tiny kitchen, elbows bumping and laughter echoing as we tried not to burn the garlic. We ate on the small back deck, legs stretched out, watching the sun sink behind the trees. She rested her head on my shoulder as twilight wrapped around us. "This is dangerous," she said quietly. "Why?" "Because it feels like a life I could fall into." "And what's so bad about that?" I asked, keeping my eyes on the fading horizon. She didn't answer, but I felt her hand find mine under the table. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds and the smell of coffee. She was already outside, bundled in a blanket, her knees pulled to her chest. I stepped out onto the porch, and she turned her head, smiling that sleepy, honest smile that made her eyes squint slightly at the corners. I think I forgot what it feels like to wake up without anxiety, she said. No emails, no pressure, just ... The smell of pine and someone next to me who doesn't ask me to be anyone else. We spent the afternoon on the water. I rented a canoe from a nearby lodge. And despite Eliza's insistence that she had no upper body strength, she was a natural. We paddled lazily across the glassy lake, the silence broken only by the occasional call of a bird or the gentle dip of the oars. At one point, she let her hand trail through the water and turned to me with a look I hadn't seen before. Peaceful, grounded, maybe even hopeful. I didn't think I could do this anymore, she said. Not just the canoe, any of it. Changed you? That night, we built a fire in the pit behind the cabin and roasted marshmallows like kids. She smeared chocolate on her cheek and pretended not to notice when I teased her for it. We talked about everything, our worst dates. It's the most reckless thing we'd ever done, the fears we still carried in the back pocket of our minds. I told her about the time I nearly took a job across the country, but backed out at the last second because something didn't sit right in my gut. She told me about a poetry book she wrote in college but never showed anyone, even though a professor once said she had something rare. You still have it? I asked. She nodded, buried in a box somewhere under a lifetime of caution. I'd like to read it someday, maybe. When we climbed into bed that night, everything felt unhurried. Her head on my chest, my arm around her shoulder, legs tangled in the warmth of the quilt. We didn't speak much, just listened to the crackle of the leftover fire outside and the occasional creak of the old cabin as it settled into the night. She traced circles on my chest with her fingers and whispered, "What happens if we let ourselves be happy and then it ends?" I kissed her forehead. Then we'll know it was real while it lasted. And maybe that's enough. It wasn't a promise of forever. It wasn't a grand declaration. But it was enough for that moment. Enough to let her fall asleep knowing she was safe, not just in the cabin, but in us. That weekend became a Marcora memory we'd return to. Over and over, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. A reminder that love can feel like warm coffee, sore arms from paddling, laughter over burned garlic, a quiet hand in yours beneath a sky full of stars, and maybe, just maybe, that's the kind of love that lasts. The morning after that quiet, unraveling on her couch, something subtle had shifted. Not the earth-shaking kind of change, but the kind you feel in how someone's shoulders rest a little lower, or how their smile lingers just a few beats longer. Eliza and I didn't talk much that morning, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that comes after a shared truth has been laid bare, unapologetic and no longer heavy. I made her coffee while she sat on the porch. In one of my old flannel shirts, legs tucked under her, mug cradled in both hands like an anchor. When I joined her outside, she didn't say anything at first, just handed me the second mug and leaned into my shoulder. It was early, the sky still bruised with leftover night, and for a long moment we simply watched the world breathe. Later that day, as we were walking through the farmer's market, the sun higher now and the air filled with that sweet, earthy scent of fresh produce and cut flowers, Eliza stopped by a stall selling handmade soaps and candles. She picked up a tiny tin labeled cedar and ash and held it to her nose, smiling. "Smells like your truck," she said with a small laugh. And for the first time in days, I saw the glint of something carefree in her eyes. That's when I brought it up again. The trip. The cabin. "I know it scared you," I said, watching her examine a jar of wild honey. "But what if we just tried it? Nothing fancy. Just a weekend to unplug and do nothing together. No expectations, no schedule." She looked up at me, a honey jar still in her hand, and for a second, I couldn't read her. Then she surprised me by nodding. "Let's do it." We left that market with a small bag of candles, a loaf of sourdough, and 2 jars of local preserves, and by the next morning, we're driving up toward the lake cabin I'd booked, a modest little place, tucked behind a row of pines with creaky floorboards, mismatched mugs in the cabinets, and a view of the water that made your whole body slow down just by looking at it. Eliza rested her bare feet on the dashboard, sunglasses sliding down her nose, window halfway open so the breeze could tangle her hair. I glanced at her more than once on that drive, trying to memorize what she looked like when she wasn't guarded. When we arrived, she stepped out of the truck and just stood there for a minute, arms folded loosely over her chest, head tilted, as she listened to the wind rustling through the trees. "It's quiet," she said softly. "That's the point," I replied. Inside the cabin, everything was wood walls. Ceiling, even the kitchen counters. There was a small fireplace, couch that sagged in the middle, and a bed covered in an old quilt that smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. She explored it slowly, touching things with her fingertips like she was trying to connect with the years etched into them. "You ever just feel like a place remembers the people who've stayed here before?" she asked while running her hand along the edge of the window pane. "All the time," I said. But I think it remembers the quiet moments more than the loud ones. That first evening, we cooked pasta together in the tiny kitchen, elbows bumping and laughter echoing as we tried not to burn the garlic. We ate on the small back deck, legs stretched out, watching the sun sink behind the trees. She rested her head on my shoulder as twilight wrapped around us. "This is dangerous," she said quietly. "Why?" "'Cause it feels like a life I could fall into. And what's so bad about that?" I asked, keeping my eyes on the fading horizon. She didn't answer, but I felt her hand find mine under the table. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds and the smell of coffee. She was already outside, bundled in a blanket, her knees pulled to her chest. I stepped out onto the porch, and she turned her head, smiling that sleepy, honest smile that made her eyes squint slightly at the corners. "It feels like to wake up without anxiety," she said. "No emails, no pressure, just ... The smell of pine and someone next to me who doesn't ask me to be anyone else." We spent the afternoon on the water. I rented a canoe from a nearby lodge, and despite Eliza's insistence that she had no upper body strength, she was a natural. We paddled lazily across the glassy lake, the silence broken only by the occasional call of a bird or the gentle dip of the oars. At one point, she let her hand trail through the water and turned to me with a look I hadn't seen before, peaceful, grounded, maybe even hopeful. "I didn't think I could do this anymore," she said. "Not just the canoe, any of it." "What changed you?" That night, we built a fire in the pit behind the cabin and roasted marshmallows like kids. She smeared chocolate on her cheek and pretended not to notice when I teased her for it. We talked about everything, our worst dates, the most reckless thing we'd ever done, the fears we still carried in the back pocket of our minds. I told her about the time I nearly took a job across the country but backed out at the last. Second, because something didn't sit right in my gut. She told me about a poetry book she wrote in college but never showed anyone, even though a professor once said she had something rare. "You still have it?" I asked. She nodded, buried in a box somewhere under a lifetime of caution. "I'd like to read it someday, maybe." When we climbed into bed that night, everything felt unhurried. Her head on my chest, my arm around her shoulder, legs tangled in the warmth of the quilt. We didn't speak much, just listened to the crackle of the leftover fire outside and the occasional creak of the old cabin as it settled into the night. She traced circles on my chest with her fingers and whispered, "What happens if we let ourselves be happy and then it ends?" I kissed her forehead. "Then we'll know it was real while it lasted, and maybe that's enough." But it wasn't. A promise of forever. It wasn't a grand declaration, but it was enough for that moment. Enough to let her fall asleep, knowing she was safe, not just in the cabin, but in us. That weekend became a marker, a memory we'd return to over and over, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. A reminder that love can feel like warm coffee, sore arms from paddling, laughter over burned garlic, and a quiet hand in yours beneath a sky full of stars. And maybe, just maybe, that's the kind of love that lasts. Coming back from the lake, cabin felt like landing after floating, your feet hitting the ground a little harder than expected. Gravity reminding you of everything you left behind, even if just for a few days. The drive home was quiet, but not tense, just thoughtful. Eliza stared out the passenger window most of the way, her fingers absently tracing small shapes on the glass, as if holding on to the stillness we'd soaked in all weekend. I didn't press her with questions or try to fill the silence. I knew. Her mind was working through something. She'd bring me into it when she was ready. When we pulled up to her house, her porch light was still on, and a small stack of mail sat tucked under the welcome mat. The neighborhood, with its trimmed hedges and distant hum of lawnmowers, felt oddly foreign after days of trees and birdsong. As she stepped out of the truck, I noticed the way she lingered with the door open, one foot still inside like she wasn't quite ready to cross the threshold back into normalcy. "You okay?" I asked as I came around with her overnight bag. She nodded, but the smile didn't quite reach her eyes, just ... bracing. I walked her to the door, waited while she unlocked it, and followed her inside. The air smelled like unopened windows and old wood. She dropped her keys into the ceramic dish by the door, the sound of it unusually loud in the stillness. I set her bag down and turned to her, unsure if I should stay or give her space. "You want me to hang out a bit?" I offered gently. She looked at me for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, but can we not talk too much tonight? I just want to be near someone who doesn't need me to explain anything." I stayed. We sat on the couch with a blanket draped. Over us, some old black and white film playing on low volume. She leaned against me without words, her body soft and tired. I held her hand as it rested on her lap, and eventually her breathing slowed, her head slipping onto my shoulder. She didn't fall asleep, not fully, but the edge she'd been carrying since we left the cabin dulled slightly. The next morning, she was gone before I woke up. She'd left a note on the kitchen table in her usual neat handwriting. "Early meeting at the gallery. Didn't want to wake you. Thanks for the quiet." I made myself coffee and sat in the silence, wondering what kind of world she was stepping back into, and how much of that world still tugged at her like an invisible thread. The shift became clearer over the next few days. Her texts grew shorter, still kind, still present, but less spontaneous. Her voice on the phone had a professional tone again, like she was back in Eliza at work mode. When we did see each other, she was there, but some part of her seemed to be running in the background, processing emails or planning exhibits. One night, over takeout and a bottle of wine she barely touched, she told me about a potential feature. For her newest artist, it could open doors for the entire gallery, she said. But there was a weight behind her words. Like success came with strings knotted too tight to ignore. I listened, asked questions, nodded in the right places. But part of me was beginning to recognize something I hadn't considered before. Eliza was a woman who carried her independence like armor. Her success hadn't just been professional lit, had been her refuge, her identity, her safety net after her divorce. And now being with me meant blurring the edges of that self-constructed world. It wasn't that she didn't want me in it. It was that she wasn't sure how to let me in without compromising the space she'd fought so hard to reclaim. One evening, stopped by unannounced, something I hadn't done before. I brought pastries. From a bakery I knew she liked and a new book by an author she'd once mentioned. She opened the door looking tired, her hair tied up in a messy bun. Reading glasses perched on the tip of her nose. "Hey," I said softly, holding up the bag like a peace offering. She hesitated, then stepped aside to let me in. "Rough day," she admitted. I followed her into the kitchen, set the bag down, and turned to face her. "Want to talk about it?" She looked up at me, something unreadable in her eyes. "I'm not sure talking would help." I leaned against the counter. "Okay, then let's not talk. Just eat sugar and pretend the world doesn't exist." That made her smile, the first real one in days. We sat on her living room floor, the box of pastries between us, powdered sugar dusting her dark leggings like snow. She picked at a croissant, while I told her a story about a plumbing job I botched years ago, and eventually the lines in her forehead softened. But as the evening went on, she became quiet again. "I'm afraid I'm going to mess this up," she said suddenly. I looked at her. "Mess what up, you? Us?" Her fingers twisted the napkin on her lap. "I'm not used to letting someone into my life like this. My schedule, my brain, it's all so regimented. I like control. I need it. And I don't want to accidentally push you away because I forget how to do normal. I reached across and took her hand. You don't have to do normal. You just have to do real. We're figuring it out as we go. There's no script. She stared at our hands for a moment. What if I don't know how to be in something healthy? Then we learned together. Later, as we cleaned up and I grabbed my jacket to head out, she walked me to the door and rested her hand on my chest. You're patient with me in ways I never expected. Because you're worth the wait, I said. She didn't respond. Just leaned in and kissed me a soft, slow kiss that felt less like an answer and more like a thank you. That night, I realized that being with Eliza wasn't going to be simple. It wouldn't follow a straight line or wrap up in a neat little bow. There would be pauses and pullbacks, in days where her independence flared up like a defense mechanism. But there would also be pastries on the floor, unexpected kisses, and a quiet, growing trust that didn't need to be spoken to be understood. We weren't just building a relationship. We were unlearning what relationships had meant before. And that, I was beginning to see, was its own kind of beautiful. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt almost domestic. There was comfort in the routines we didn't plan, but naturally created her texting me when her meetings ran late. Me leaving small surprises at her front door when I knew she'd had a rough day. We weren't defining things out loud, but the way she reached for my hand without hesitation, or leaned into me during quiet moments said enough. It wasn't perfect, but it felt honest, steady, real. Then, without warning, the past knocked on her front door. It was a Sunday morning. I was making breakfast in her kitchen pancakes, something she'd teased me about being absurdly proud of while she showered. The smell of maple syrup was starting to fill the room when I heard the doorbell ring. I assumed it was a neighbor or a delivery, so I wiped my hands on a towel and went to open it. The man standing on the porch was tall, dressed too sharply for a Sunday morning, with gray at his temples and a gaze that swept past me before settling somewhere behind my shoulder. He didn't introduce himself right away, just gave a tight nod and said, "Is Eliza home?" Something about his posture, his tone knit clicked. Not jealousy, not suspicion, but instinct. I knew who he was before she even appeared in the hallway. Behind me, Eliza called, stepping aside but not moving from the doorway. She emerged, towel still wrapped in her hair, her expression freezing mid-step as she saw him. "Colin," she said flatly. Her ex-husband, the man who'd unraveled so much of her confidence and shaped so much of her guardedness. I was in town. For a few days, he said, hands in his pockets now, trying to project nonchalance, but clearly rattled. Thought I'd drop by. Eliza didn't move closer. She stood behind me, arms folded, chin slightly raised. Why? There was a pause. Too long for comfort. Then he gestured vaguely. "You haven't returned my emails. I thought we could talk, catch up, maybe clear the air." She didn't invite him in, didn't offer him a seat or even a sip of water. "There's nothing that needs clearing, Colin, not after all this time." He looked past her again, eyes flicking toward the sound of the sizzling pan in the kitchen. "Right," he said, voice cooler now. "I see you've moved on." Before she could respond, I gently stepped forward. "Eliza, I'll give you two. A moment if you want privacy?" She shook her head immediately. "No, there's nothing here that needs privacy." Her words landed with weight. She wasn't being cruel. She was being firm, resolute. The woman who had once confessed to building her entire identity around being alone was now standing beside someone. Unflinching, clear-eyed. I realized in that moment how much had changed not just in our relationship, but within her. Colin, left after only a few minutes, clearly unsettled by how little room he now occupied in her world. As the door closed behind him, she leaned back against it, exhaling deeply. "You okay?" I asked quietly. She nodded, but there was a tremble in her fingers. "I am. It just shook something loose. I thought I was over him completely." "I am. But seeing him like that, seeing him see me happy, made me realize how much I've had to rebuild." I crossed the room and wrapped my arms around her, and she didn't resist. "You've done more than rebuild," I said. "You've redefined. You've made something new. Not for him, for you. She held me tightly then, and I could feel the quiet quake in her breathing. Not because she missed what had been, but because she was beginning to believe that what she had now was finally hers to keep. The rest of that Sunday unfolded slowly, wrapped in a kind of silence that wasn't heavy, but thoughtful. Lisa didn't retreat the way I half expected her to. She didn't disappear into her room or bury herself in her work. Instead, after a few moments against the closed door, she looked up at me with eyes that were tired. Yes, but clearer than before. We didn't say much as we moved back into the kitchen. The pancakes had cooled, but she reheated them in the oven while I made fresh coffee. Both of us moving in quiet sync like we'd been doing this for years. We sat at her small dining table, the sunlight filtering through the sheer curtains in soft golden beams, and for a few minutes, we ate in silence. Eliza buttered her pancake, meticulously, one edge at a time, and then finally looked up at me. I didn't think seeing him again would affect me, she said. Not because I still have feelings for him, but because I assumed I'd grown past it all. But it turns out, healing doesn't erase memory. It just quiets it. I reached across the table and took her hand. Healing isn't about forgetting. It's about remembering without breaking. She smiled softly at that, and her thumb brushed lightly over my fingers. Do you know what struck me the most? It wasn't that he showed up. It was how little I needed him to explain anything. A year ago, I would have invited him in, tried to make peace, tried to prove something. Today, I didn't even want closure. That's new for me. We cleared the dishes together after breakfast and settled into the living room. The morning had slipped into afternoon without us noticing, and Eliza curled up beside me on the couch with her head resting on my chest. I could feel her breathing slow, the tension in her shoulders fading bit by bit. Didn't fall asleep. But she stayed like that for a long time, the kind of closeness that said more than words could manage. Later that day, she stood by her bookshelf, scanning the spines like she was looking for something buried. Then she reached behind a row of novels and pulled out a small, worn journal, the poetry collection she'd once mentioned but never shared. She handed it to me, her fingers brushing mine. I want you to read it, she said. I think I'm ready? I took the journal carefully. The pages yellowed at the edges, her name scribbled in small cursive on the inside cover. Are you sure? She nodded. I want you to see the parts of me I've hidden, even from myself. That night I read her words slowly while she made tea, her voice humming softly from the kitchen. Her poetry was raw, elegant, and unguarded in a way that made my chest ache. It was like walking through the blueprint of her soul, her disappointments, her longings, her defiance, her hope. When she returned to the room and found me wiping my eyes, she didn't tease. She sat beside me, knees tucked under her, and whispered, That's the version of me I used to silence. You make me want to hear her again? I closed the journal and placed it gently on the table. She's worth listening to, and so are you. She leaned her head on my shoulder again and let out a long, steady breath. I've spent so long thinking I had to rebuild myself into someone sharper, more armored, to survive. But lately, with you, I've remembered how soft strength can be. There was no grand gesture that night, no cinematic confession.
Ow.
Just her bare feet brushing mine under the blanket, and my arm resting across her side as we watched the fire in the fireplace flicker and fade. Sometimes, the most powerful moments come not in passion, but in peace, in the quiet knowing that someone sees you completely and stays anyway. The following week brought a shift in the air, not dramatic like a storm, but like the early stirrings of spring after a long, inward winter. Eliza was different, not changed in a way that made her unrecognizable, but open in ways I hadn't seen before. She started sending me photos of her gallery space between meetings, close-ups of unfinished canvases, snapshots of artists mid-process, her own notes scribbled in margins. It felt like she was letting me see the inside of her creative world, and not just the polished version she presented to the public. One afternoon, she sent a picture of an empty wall in the gallery and wrote, I think it's time I hang my own work here. That message stayed with me all day. I'd known since our early conversations that Eliza used to paint, but she'd always brushed it off, calling it something she used to do in another life. But now, after the weekend at the cabin, after the poetry journal, after standing firm in front of her ex, it was like she was calling pieces of herself back home. I encouraged her without pushing. Sometimes all someone needs is someone quietly standing behind them whispering, "You can." One evening, she invited me to her studio space, a quiet upstairs room in her house I hadn't been in before. She warned me with a grin that it was chaotic in a sacred kind of way, and she wasn't wrong. The room was layered and color-old. Canvases leaning against walls, brushes in jars, paint-splattered drop cloths underfoot, and sunlight cutting through the windows in golden streaks. There was something vulnerable about being let into this space. A part of her identity even more personal than the poetry. She stood in the center of the room, barefoot, a smear of ochre paint on her wrist, looked around like she was reacquainting herself with an old friend. "I haven't painted in almost 6 years," she said softly, not seriously. I think I stopped because I was scared I wouldn't have anything left to say that mattered. I walked to one of the blank canvases and tapped it gently. "Maybe you're not trying to say something new? Maybe you're trying to say something honest." She looked at me then, eyes shimmering, not with tears, but with certainty. "I want to create something that feels like this moment, not just beauty, truth." That night, she painted until well past midnight, while I sat on the floor with a book, occasionally looking up just to watch her in motion. There was something almost holy in the way she moved, brush in hand, shoulders relaxed, expression focused and free. She didn't ask for input, didn't look for approval. She was creating for herself. I was just the witness. In the days that followed, her energy shifted even more. She became electric, ideas spilling out of her faster than she could organize them. She asked her assistant to clear a week on her calendar and began preparing a small personal exhibit, something she hadn't done since her early 30s. "Just a few pieces," she said, almost downplaying it, but I could see the fire behind her eyes. This wasn't about proving something to the world. It was about proving something to herself, that her voice still mattered, that her art didn't need permission to exist. Watching her step back into that space, her space, was like watching someone relearn how to breathe after years of holding their breath. I wasn't part of her art, not directly, but I was part of the quiet foundation it rested on now, and that was enough. More than enough. The invitation came on a Wednesday. Eliza was already deep into the process of preparing her pieces for the small gallery showing she had quietly announced the week before. What had begun as a simple intention to hang one painting had blossomed into a 6-piece collection of abstract work that pulsed with color, emotion, and unapologetic vulnerability. I'd seen each one take form in her studio, each brushstroke, telling the story of a woman not reinventing herself, but reclaiming what had always been there. She stood in the kitchen, reading the message aloud from her phone, her voice equal parts stunned and cautious. It was from a curator at a boutique modern art space in Portland, who had once reviewed her earlier work nearly a decade ago and happened to see her new post about the upcoming exhibit. He asked if she'd be interested in submitting her new pieces for an upcoming group show featuring mid-career female artists redefining their voice. Eliza read the message twice before setting the phone down and staring out the window. "It's just an invitation to submit," she said, almost to herself, as if saying it aloud might lessen the pressure. But I could feel the air shift around her. The moment was real, and she knew it. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her tea. I stepped closer, leaning on the counter beside her. "Do you want it?" She didn't answer right away. "Then, I think, I do. I just didn't expect it to happen this fast. I'm not sure I'm ready to be seen on that level." "Again, you're not the same artist you were 10 years ago," I said. "You've lived a whole lifetime since then. Maybe that's exactly what makes your voice more valuable now." She turned to me, eyes wide, searching. "Are you scared too?" It was the first time she'd asked me that, and I realized I was, not because of her success or the shifts in our rhythm, but because she was growing fast, courageously. And I hadn't yet asked myself if I was doing the same. I'd been so comfortable being the anchor, the calm, the steady. But now I started to feel something stirring in me too. I'd been working as a handyman for nearly a decade, and while I loved the honesty of the work, the simplicity of it. I'd always shelved an old dream of restoring historic homes. Not just fixing fences or painting kitchens, but bringing decaying beauty back to life in a more meaningful, creative way. The kind of work that required vision and long-term commitment. The kind that terrified me because it required me to take myself seriously. That night, after Eliza went to bed, I stayed up and pulled out an old notebook I hadn't touched in years. Inside were scribbled plans for a Victorian house in a nearby town I'd once dreamed of buying and restoring. Through the pages, dusty with doubt, but suddenly alive with potential again. Maybe it was her courage rubbing off on me. Maybe it was just finally time. The next morning I mentioned it to her over breakfast. I half expected her to nod politely and move on, but instead she put her fork down and looked directly at me. "Do it," she said. "You tell me to step into my voice every day. You have one too." In that moment, we weren't just two people cautiously learning how to love again. We were two people standing on the edge of something bigger, willing to grow, not just alongside each other, but because of each other. The evening of Eliza's exhibit arrived cloaked in the kind of quiet anticipation that felt almost like ceremony. Her gallery space had been transformed into a haven of light, and honest as 6 of her paintings stood proudly against stark white walls, each one humming with depth and story. She hadn't given them names, she said, because titles would only box in what she hoped others would interpret freely. They were expressions of her own reclaimed voice, and she wanted people to meet them on their own terms, the same way she had learned to meet herself. The room filled slowly with guests' friends, artists, a couple of local critics, and even a few familiar faces from her past. I stood to the side at first, not wanting to cast a shadow on her moment, but it wasn't. Long before she reached for my hand and pulled me into her orbit, her fingers were cold with nerves, but her posture remained tall, open, unafraid. I could see it in her eyes. This wasn't just a show, it was a statement. A gentle but firm declaration that she had stepped back into herself and wasn't going anywhere this time, as the evening carried on. I watched her move through the room with a quiet confidence that I'd only ever seen glimpses of before. She answered questions with poise, laughed without overthinking it, and leaned into conversations instead of backing away. At one point, I caught her standing in front of her largest painting, an explosion of stormy blues and sharp gold lines. Streaking across the canvas, and I saw a woman who wasn't trying to be understood anymore. She simply was. When the crowd had thinned and the gallery had quieted, we stood alone together in front of that same piece. She looked at it for a long moment and said, "I think this one is about you and me, and what it feels like to be seen without needing to explain." I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. I just wrapped my arm around her and let her lean into the stillness. That night, as we walked home hand in hand through quiet streets, I felt a shift not just in her, but in me. I had submitted my own application that week to a program offering small business grants for heritage home restoration. It wasn't flashy or loud, but it was a first step, claim, and I owed that courage, in part, to her. Back at her house, I glanced around the kitchen, the space where everything had begun, where I dipped a brush in warm paint and stepped unknowingly into a whole new season of my life. She noticed me smiling and asked what I was thinking. "Just realizing," I said, "that sometimes fixing up someone else's space ends up helping you rebuild your own." She leaned her head against my shoulder, and together we stood in that room still, content changed. The question she'd once asked me at the start of it all, would I date a 45-year-old like her now? Answered not in a single word or grand gesture, but in thousands of quiet choices since. Choices to stay, to listen, to grow. We hadn't labeled what we were, and maybe we didn't need to. What mattered more was that we were both finally moving forward, full-hearted, unafraid, and side by side. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.